Hi, my name is David Warner Matheson, and today is July 31st, 2019, which is the date of a new moon. So in 5 days, it will be the annual celebration of the Hindu festival of Naga Panchami, which is celebrated each year in the 5th day of the waxing moon during this particular lunar month. So in 2019, that festival will be celebrated on August 5th of 2019. On the day of Naga Panchami, cobra snakes are worshipped. The word Nag or Naga signifies a cobra. Cobra snakes are worshipped, and effigies of cobras made of wood or precious metal are presented with offerings, and they're bathed in milk. Now, this video isn't being made in order to condone or approve of the abuse of wild animals, including cobras. I'm making this video in order to explain the celestial foundations of the myths and traditions of the world, the ancient myths and sacred stories around the world that are based on celestial metaphor, including the ancient myths and traditions surrounding the annual festival of Naga Panchami. The origins of the Naga Panchami festival are traced back to ancient Sanskrit texts, including the Mahabharata and the Puranas, which describe ancient myths which this festival commemorates. The Naga Panchami festival and the worship of the serpents commemorates the saving of the snakes from destruction at the hands of a king named Janamejaya, whose father, Parikshit, was killed by a powerful Naga named Taksaka. The Puranas relate that King Parikshit ascended to the throne of Hastinapur after the great YUDHISHTHIRA, the eldest of the Pandavas, in the Mahabharata. One day, while King Parikshit was out hunting deer with his bow, he became extremely thirsty and stopped by the hermitage of a great sage named Angirasa, hoping to be given some water to slake his thirst. But the great sage, the Puranas relate, had stopped the functioning of his senses, breath, mind, and spirit, and was totally at rest. He had reached the stage beyond the 3 stages of consciousness, and so had become Brahman without qualification. When the king found that his request for water was being ignored, and he wasn't even offered a place to sit or shown any hospitality at all, he became irate, and he took the tip of his bow, and he picked up a dead snake, and he draped it over the shoulders of the great seer. And then he went back to his city, and he was wondering to himself the whole time if this Brahmin had his eyes closed because he had actually suspended all his faculties, or if he was faking a trance in order to be able to ignore the thirsty king. So later, when the young son of the great sage came into the hut and saw the dead snake draped over his father's shoulders, the boy became enraged at the insult. And so he went, and in the witness of his friends, he touched the water of the river and uttered a great curse upon the king, declaring that in 7 days the flying serpent Taksaka would bite the one who had insulted his father and end his life. So when the great sage himself, Angirasa, heard the lamentation of his son came back into the hut and saw the dead snake and was crying and weeping over this great insult. So when this great sage Angirasa heard the lamentation of his son, he started to wake up, and he opened his eyes slowly, and he saw the dead snake on his own shoulders, And he saw his son crying, and he asked what was the matter. And when he heard that of the curse that his son had uttered against the king, he did not approve. And he said, "Alas, you've committed a grave offense. For a small slight, you've imposed a great punishment." Now, as for the king, Parikshit, he felt remorse for what he'd done, and he sat down by the Ganges and prayed to Krishna and decided to starve himself to death. And in 7 days, he was bitten by the serpent and died. And his own son, Janamejaya, became the king in his place, and he decided to get revenge. And he wanted to get revenge on all the serpents. So Janamejaya created a great fire sacrifice, which is called the Sarpa Yaga. And this fire furnace, they made a great furnace of bricks and built a big fire in it. And it was constructed in such a way, with such a ritual, that it would draw all the Nagas of the world into the fire to perish. However, Astika, a rishi, who's the son of the serpent goddess Manasa Devi, Astika went to King Janamejaya and convinced him to cease the Sarpa Yaga after all these serpents were being destroyed. Astika went to Janamejaya and talked him out of continuing the Sarpa Yaga and destroying all the serpents. So before all the serpents were destroyed, the king changed his mind and put an end to the Sarpa Yaga, and that is the saving of the serpents. That's commemorated in the annual observation of Naga Panchami. At this time of year, the 5th day of the moon of this particular lunar month, in traditional celebrations that still remember these ancient myths and sacred stories. Now, these ancient myths, in common with virtually all of the world's ancient myths from cultures around the globe, can be shown to be based on celestial metaphor. The placing of a serpent over the shoulders of the meditating sage, for example, that started this whole series of events, clearly reflects in myth the constellation Ophiuchus in the heavens, which is a constellation which appears to have a serpent body draped around it. One half of the serpent is seen on one side of this central body, the other half on the other side, and this figure of Ophiuchus in the heavens is a very mythologically important constellation. Often corresponds in ancient myth to a figure in deep meditation, as I discuss in my most recent book entitled The Ancient Worldwide System. Indeed, there's a different story in the Mahabharata, which I discuss in this most recent book, in which a great sage meditates so deeply that ants or termites build a huge mound around his body while he's sitting in meditation. And well, this is an extremely interesting detail about a meditating sage, because as I show in the same volume, the same most recent book, the constellation Ophiuchus is associated with an anthill, takes on the role of an anthill or a termite mound in one of the myths of ancient Australia, one of the myths preserved by the Aboriginal nations of Australia. In other words, this very same constellation, Ophiuchus, can be shown to play very similar roles in many myths from cultures not thought to have had any contact with one another according to conventional history. So, in many myths, Ophiuchus is associated with a figure in deep meditation or trance, which is clearly the case in this story, in which the sage Angirasa is in a deep trance and has the snake draped over his shoulders. Now the king, who uses the tip of his bow to pick up the dead snake and drape it over the meditating sage, is probably connected to the constellation Sagittarius, which in the heavens is holding out a great bow towards the direction of the constellations Scorpio and Ophiuchus. Scorpio plays a great serpent. Scorpio appears as a great serpent in many myths around the world. And Scorpio is located immediately across from Sagittarius in the heavens, right adjacent to Sagittarius, and also directly below Ophiuchus. So Sagittarius is probably picking up this dead snake with the bow and draping it over Ophiuchus. So Sagittarius and Ophiuchus appear together in many important myths from around the globe. So the act of saving the serpents from this great fire sacrifice, now that we've identified the region of the sky that we're talking about, saving the serpents from a great fire almost certainly corresponds to the Milky Way galaxy. So the constellation Scorpio, which probably corresponds to the great Taksaka in this myth, is halfway within the column of the Milky Way in the heavens. The Milky Way band in myth often plays the role of a great fire, or a column of fire, a pillar of fire or smoke, in many, many myths around the world, some of which are discussed in this most recent book. But the Milky Way is often a great fire. And then when we commemorate the saving of this serpent, or the Nagas, from this great fire, what is done to the serpents? They pour milk on them, the Milky Way. So the fact that the worshippers to this day are anointing the serpents with milk is a pretty strong indication that the analysis that I'm giving you here, connecting to the stars in this particular region of the heavens, is accurate. So the celebration of Naga Panchami comes from a celestial foundation. And that same Milky Way that was envisioned as a fire, and which was used to destroy the serpents, also appears and is commemorated with this pouring of milk over the serpents after they're saved from the wrath of King Janamejaya. There's another aspect of the celebration of Naga Panchami which helps to confirm the analysis even further, and that's the fact that in some parts of India on this day, ant hills are adorned with colored pigments and spices and garlands, and milk is poured into the holes of these ant hills in order to bathe or anoint the serpents which are thought to live within these holes in the ant hills. So this ritual clearly points back to this connection to the constellation Ophiuchus that I mentioned earlier, which turns up in the myths of more than one culture of the world, and sometimes is connected to an anthill, sometimes is connected to a meditating figure, and in one instance is even connected to a meditating figure who meditates for so long that an anthill gets built up around him. So I'm convinced that this ancient festival of Naga Panchami, which is still observed to this very day, has its origins in very ancient myths, which themselves can be shown to relate to specific constellations in the heavens. And these myths are closely related to other myths from around the world, and they can all be seen to be built on this very same system of celestial metaphor which underlies the ancient myths and sacred stories from virtually every culture on our planet. And this indicates that they're not actually about ancient personages. You might ask yourself, well, why are they connecting these myths to these stars? They're metaphors using the stars, which are actually relating to our own lives. The motion of the stars of rising up into the heavens and then sinking down into the earth actually pictures what we go through. I'm convinced that that's what these star myths are using, a very beautiful system of metaphor which actually relates to our own lives, and it's intended to convey profound truths to us in a very esoteric fashion that will go right to the heart by presenting it in this form. So this myth, this particular myth, that is at the heart of the Naga Panchami festival clearly relates to an important theme that's found in ancient traditions of many cultures, relating to the importance of blessing rather than cursing. Cursing is shown to have very negative consequences in this story. And the great sage Angirusa is actually the one who is insulted. He's not upset about the insult that he received. He's upset about the curse that his child, his son, hastily throws this curse upon the king. And this theme of blessing and not cursing is illustrated here. The sage doesn't feel the need to curse. And he's very upset that his son has done so. Blessing rather than cursing is a theme that we find in many other traditions around the world. You may be familiar with the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. Both the Old, so-called Old Testament and so-called New Testament of the scriptures that we call the Bible deal quite often and quite powerfully, speak quite powerfully about blessing and not cursing. And I would argue that one reason that cursing is depicted in such a negative light is that it reveals anxiety and alienation in the one who's doing the cursing. It's, for example, in this story, the enlightened sage is not threatened at all by the insult of a dead snake being placed on his shoulders. It's only his young son who's apparently insecure in some way and therefore feels threatened or insulted or diminished by the action of this king, which the king realizes he's wrong later. So it's actually the king's action reflects on the king. The fact that the son gets so upset reflects something about him, his own immaturity. That's what the father, the sage, says. It's your own. Your mind is not ripe. That's why you have that. You're not fully developed and integrated. That's why you had this reaction, this wrong reaction. He becomes insecure and feels threatened and falls into a rage and curses about the king's action and overreacts. And I would suggest that if you think about it very carefully, when you fall into a rage, when I fall into a rage and start cursing someone else or something else, if I start cursing, I'm trying to fix something in the house. I'm trying to fix a lock on the door, and I start cursing. It's really reflecting insecurity about myself. It's revealing a schism in myself. It's revealing anxiety in myself, doubt in myself. That's why cursing others, I would suggest, is probably warned against in so many ancient texts and traditions, because it's actually revealing our own alienation from ourselves. It's actually exacerbating our alienation from ourselves. By cursing, we're actually cursing against ourselves when we're ostensibly cursing others or cursing something else. So in this myth, the curse of the young son brings about a great calamity, a calamity that affects many people and Nagas. And it's the undoing of the multi-generational aspect and impact of this curse that's celebrated to this day in the festival of Naga Panchami. And that's worthy of careful consideration and reflection. And I would argue has a lesson for all of us right up to the present moment. This ancient myth speaks to us in this present moment where we are right now, in this very present instant.